Shauna Ann Castleton was born in 1966 in Salt Lake City, Utah. She had an older sister, Paula, with whom she remained very close throughout her life. In 1994, at the age of 28, Shauna decided to move to the city of her dreams, Las Vegas. For the girl, it was a city of great opportunity. She initially worked as a salesperson in a cosmetic store, but she aspired to better things. Shauna was drawn to the city's nightlife, where money, success, and wealth were abundant. Her dream came true when she was hired as a waitress at one of Las Vegas's finest casinos, the Palms, thanks to her beautiful appearance. Very outgoing, Shauna quickly settled into her job and made friends. Her colleagues became her second family. Shauna was always smiling, radiant, and in a good mood. Her loved ones called her Barbie for her smile, blonde hair, and beautiful appearance. Shauna loved her job, and her clients adored her. The young woman earned a comfortable income of around $100,000 a year. The Palms Casino brought her not only wealth and friendship, but also love. It was in 2002 that Shauna met her future husband, George Tiafi. It was love at first sight. George was handsome, charismatic, and charming. George was a great guy. At the time, he was a firefighter helping people. The man was close to his family, sending money home every month to help his mother care for his disabled younger sister. George's handsome appearance earned him a spot in a firefighter's calendar. Together, they were a beautiful, vibrant couple, and they loved each other dearly. From their very first meeting, they became inseparable and soon moved in together. A year later, they had a daughter, whom they named Madison. His daughter became the meaning of Sean's life. She spent time raising her and looking after the house, while her husband worked as a firefighter. 3 years later, they married in Hawaii, on the ocean. It was a beautiful, intimate ceremony for only their closest family. Their life was like a fairy tale, but this story won't have a happy ending. 2 years later, the family began to experience problems. George suffered financial setbacks and lost a significant amount of money in the real estate market. Shona was forced to return to work and become the family's primary breadwinner. Her husband barely worked and fell into depression. He didn't like the situation, but at the time, he couldn't cope with the financial difficulties. He began to criticize his wife for her appearance at work. He objected to Shauna's revealing dress and became jealous. But Shauna couldn't dress any differently for her job. The tension between them grew. The situation worsened when George befriended a homeless man and began inviting him home. Shauna found him creepy and intimidating. George had helped the homeless before, but he had never taken him home before, and now her husband had crossed the line. Shauna was fed up with her husband's antics. She couldn't take it anymore, and for safety reasons for herself and her daughter, after almost 10 years of marriage, she moved to her own townhouse apartment. Shauna was devastated by the situation. Those close to her saw how distressed she was over the breakup of her family. She had always been an optimist and hoped to save her marriage. The husband was also against a divorce. They tried to save the family and began seeing a family therapist, but it didn't help. The couple had too much resentment and mutual complaints. So Shauna decided to get a divorce. They began dividing custody in court. Shauna threw herself into work. Her only joys in life were her daughter and her job, which allowed her to forget her family problems. One day in early September 2012, when she returned from work, she noticed someone had been in the house. Everything was in disarray, and several valuables, including her engagement ring, had been stolen. What was odd was that her bikini was stolen along with her valuables. The thief left a pair of small boxers in the apartment. This was odd and not at all like a robbery, as the police had assumed. Shauna was terrified by this home invasion, but she decided not to panic and let it go. But by a cruel twist of fate, just 3 weeks later, someone returned to her house. And this time for a reason. On September 29th, 2012, Shauna left work as usual around 3 a.m. At 3:30 a.m., she pulled up to her apartment building, parked her car in the garage, and entered the apartment. She was never seen alive again. That morning, after George's shift ended, he picked up his 8-year-old daughter, Mighty's, from her grandmother's. He picked her up, and they headed to Shauna's to pick up some baby gear. The garage door was suspiciously open, as was the apartment door. Upon entering the apartment, they noticed it was in disarray. Some things were scattered, and Shauna's lifeless body lay on the floor in a pool of blood. The husband called 911 and reported the grisly discovery. Police arrived immediately at the crime scene. The attack on Shauna was brutal. Her skull was fractured so severely and deeply that police and paramedics initially assumed she had been shot. But the forensic expert determined that the victim had been attacked with a hammer and sustained the injury from the blow. Her fingers were broken. The woman desperately tried to defend herself, but was unable to fend off her attacker. She was brutally beaten until she showed no signs of life. In total, she received 17 blows with a hammer. Her husband became the first suspect. He found Shauna's body, and they were getting a divorce. But it turned out the husband had an airtight alibi. George was at work at the time of the crime. He had worked a 24-hour shift. His colleagues and CCTV footage confirmed this. Her husband was then ruled out as a suspect. A neighbor told investigators he had heard strange noises coming from her apartment at night, but dismissed them because Shauna always returned home at night. Another neighbor found the victim's documents, phone number, and makeup near the house. Detectives knew someone had previously broken into Shauna's apartment, stolen valuables, and left underwear behind. Even then, the police found this odd. They began to consider this possibility. Shauna was a very beautiful, striking woman, and she could have had an obsessive admirer who was stalking her. This could explain the theft of her underwear. Or she was the accidental victim of a burglar who broke into her home at the wrong time, and when she returned, he had to dispose of her as an unwanted witness. This could explain why Shauna's belongings were found near the house. The burglar could have stolen valuables and lost them while fleeing. However, it turned out that no valuables were missing from Shauna's house. This ruled out a botched robbery. Shauna's colleagues were terrified by her murder and feared her stalker might have turned on them as well. Investigators reviewed CCTV footage from her workplace to determine if anyone had been following her. However, they determined from the footage that Shauna had not been stalked. This theory, too, was called into question. Shauna's sister, Paula, upon learning of the tragedy, flew to Las Vegas with her husband to assist with the investigation. She believed the story was much simpler. Paula immediately told the police she knew who was behind the crime. She suspected Shauna's husband. She believed George either committed the murder himself or recruited someone else. At that time, the police received a tip that a homeless man had blabbed about bludgeoning a woman to death with a hammer. At first, no one believed him. But when rumors of Shauna's brutal hammer murder began to spread around the city, his story was taken more seriously. The police found the homeless man near the store where he usually stole groceries. He was carrying illegal substances, which became a good pretext for his arrest. It turned out the homeless man's name was Noel Stevens. He had previously been convicted of minor crimes, but denied any connection to Shauna's murder. Police went to the tent where he was staying. They had difficulty finding it in the desert and found many interesting items there. Bloody jeans were found next to his tent. They were sent to a lab. DNA testing confirmed the investigators' suspicions. The blood belonged to Shauna, and the suspect's DNA was found on the jeans themselves. A receipt for a store purchase was also found in the pants, and police requested CCTV footage from the store. It turned out that Noel was a customer at the time, paying for the hammer and boxer shorts at the register. When checking his phone's contact list, the police found a single contact of George's, whom they had called 87 times. It turned out to be none other than George Jaff, the husband of the murdered Shauna. This homeless man was the same John who had visited his home and frightened his wife. The woman was right to fear him and move out of the house. Noel confirmed that George, from his contact list, was his friend, a firefighter. Police reviewed the store surveillance footage again to determine how the homeless man could have gotten there. It turned out that Noel had driven there with another man, and they'd been shopping together. That man, of course, was Shauna's husband. The whole picture fit together like a puzzle. George persuaded a homeless man's friend to help him get rid of his wife. George helped him prepare for the crime, telling him what time his wife would be home and choosing a favorable day when she would be on duty, thereby providing himself with an alibi and removing suspicion from himself. George hoped to commit the perfect crime, one that would go undetected, but he miscalculated. The police told the homeless man all the evidence against him, and under pressure, he confessed to killing Shauna. Noel confirmed that George wanted her dead and paid him $600, promising to pay him tens of thousands more after he collected his wife's insurance money. The motive for the crime then became clear to the police. Money. According to Noel, he and George had been planning the crime for a long time and staged a robbery at Shauna's apartment 3 weeks in advance to mislead detectives and lead them down the wrong path. Noel idolized George for his years of support and his best friend, so he agreed to help him get rid of his wife. Noel recounted what happened in the house on the day of the crime. He snuck into Shauna's apartment while she was out, using the spare key George had given her, and waited for her. When he heard the door open, he put on his mask and hid. He bided his time. As Shauna began climbing to the second floor, he emerged from his hiding place and attacked her from behind with a hammer. She fell. He jumped on her and began hitting her with a hammer. Shauna tried to resist. She cried and screamed, "Why do you do this so many times?" And when she saw her attacker's face, she understood everything. But the criminal couldn't leave her alive anymore. Noel hit her so hard that the hammer broke. But that didn't stop him. He picked up the metal part and continued to hit her. The criminal beat the woman to death and fled the house without locking the door. Noel showed where he hid the hammer. She found herself next to a homeless man's tent. The hammer was indeed broken. The detectives called George's mother and sister in and informed them of his involvement in his wife's murder. George's family denied that he could have done such a thing. After speaking with the police, his sister called the suspect and told him that investigators knew everything and would be coming for him soon. The man was devastated. George jumped into the car, sped off at high speed, over 100 kilometers per hour, and crashed into a barrier. Police believed George was attempting suicide at that point because there were no skid marks on the road. He had intentionally caused the accident. George survived the accident but was taken to the hospital for treatment. He was later arrested for his wife's murder, and he simply said, "Okay." George and Noel were charged with Shauna's murder, but George refused to confess to his involvement in his wife's murder. A gun he purchased after his wife's death was found in George's home. Detectives believe he likely planned to kill his homeless friend as well, to avoid splitting the insurance money with him and to eliminate him as a witness in court. There was ample evidence against Noel Stevens, and he also pleaded guilty, so his trial proceeded quickly. He struck a plea bargain with the prosecution and agreed to testify against George at his trial. As a result of the plea bargain, the prosecution waived the death penalty. Noel was found guilty and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 42 years. But against George, there was only circumstantial evidence and Noel's testimony. The prosecution understood that George had manipulated his homeless friend, who wasn't very bright, to pull off the job alone. But this had to be proven. Otherwise, the husband could escape responsibility. George had a good lawyer who portrayed him to the jury as a heroic firefighter, a model family man, and a loving wife and daughter. According to the defense, Noel killed Shauna out of revenge. She disliked him and was divorcing his friend, and George had nothing to do with it. The defense also emphasized that Noel had a mental illness and experienced hallucinations, making his testimony unreliable. After this, convincing the jury of George's involvement was difficult, but the store's CCTV footage of Noel and George choosing a hammer together, as well as their phone call transcripts, were very compelling. Although even here, the lawyer tried to argue that this was meaningless. The men were allegedly simply friends, socializing frequently, and buying a hammer for work around the house. George remained remarkably calm throughout the trial, even when his best friend, Noel, testified against him. George's family, colleagues, and friends insisted he was a very kind and gentle man, never cruel or violent towards anyone. They claimed George adored Shauna and their daughter and could not have orchestrated the murder of his beloved, but the jury didn't buy it. 3 years after Shauna's brutal murder, justice prevailed. George was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder. George's family pleaded for mercy at the sentencing, but it was not forthcoming. George was sentenced to the maximum possible sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. George showed no emotion when the verdict was announced. His family disagreed with the court's decision and did not believe he was guilty. Sean's loved ones are pleased with the sentence and believe that serving time behind bars for the rest of his life will be the best punishment for him. George later attempted to appeal, claiming his defense attorney was ineffective and ignored his client's mental health issues. He was taking various medications that clouded his judgment. This led George to hear God's voice commanding him to kill his wife to protect their daughter. So he did so. His attorney refused to send him for a psychiatric evaluation, but the attorney denied this and claimed it was the first time he had heard of George's mental health issues. His appeal was rejected. Shona's 11-year-old daughter was left without parents. She lives with Shona's mother, and her Aunt Paula visits the girl frequently. Madison often thinks about her mother and misses her. Share your thoughts in the comments, and like this story if you found it interesting. And don't forget to ring the bell. Thanks for watching.